Just like the way that Carter analyzed people, if it weren't for someone yawning nonstop, he wouldn't guess that person's activities the night before for no reason. Every conjecture had its trigger, or, better put, a tell, a signal. Without the prerequisite of there being any signal, Melvin couldn't have associated Carter with turning off the lights. So was it really the slip-up in the recreation room that made Melvin want to sound him out? Utmost composure rested in Carter's heart. No matter what, he would never reveal another opening. He lifted his gaze, looking straight into Melvin's eyes, saying expressionlessly, "Are you sexually harassing a prison officer now?" Melvin tilted his head slightly with curiosity in his eyes. "So are you going to beat me with a baton?" The last time that Carter used a baton to beat someone was because the thug had groped his ass. If he battered an inmate just by these few words of provocation, he'd surely have been complained about and lost his job long before now. Since Melvin was looking forward to seeing how he'd react, he refused to show him any reaction. Carter indifferently shifted his gaze away, moving on to ask the next question. Which of the following items excites you? A. Children's socks. B. Female underwear. C. Male uniform. D. None of the above. Seeing option A, Carter inadvertently thought to himself that this was indeed a test for perversions in psychology. All of a sudden, he was a little anxious as to whether Melvin would give a dangerous answer, but it was relieving that Melvin didn't hesitate, straight away giving him an alphabet. C. Fortunately, he wasn't a pervert. Otherwise, Carter really couldn't accept that he had secretly watched a pervert for so long. Hang on. He seemed to have skipped over a key piece of information. Male uniform? Without batting an eyelid, Carter glanced down at the dark gray uniform he was wearing on himself. Inexplicably feeling very uneasy, he hastily moved on to the next question. Not long later, the questions with regards to sexual attraction finally concluded. But the next section was even more complicated. Sometimes, a single question would examine multiple aspects at the same time, and the speed with which Melvin answered also slowed noticeably. If someone was cursing your significant other to their face, would you? A. Pretend not to have heard. B. Try to reason things out with the other party. C. Sit back and watch the show. D. Pull out the other party's tongue. Melvin mulled over it for a moment before asking, "Can I knock his teeth in? It's a little disgusting to pull out his tongue." Carter said, "There isn't this option." Melvin said, "B. Then reason things out with the other party." Carter was slightly surprised. He thought that Melvin would choose D. The questions in the last section were largely related to violence, and Melvin's answers were always quite different from what Carter expected. For example, one of the questions went, if you come across your enemy about to fall off a cliff, would you? A. Pretend not to have seen. B. Remind the other party. C. Push him down. Melvin's answer was to remind the other party, but this obviously contradicted Carter's understanding of him. Previously, when Melvin was fighting with the man in black, when the other was already in a disadvantageous position, he had still knocked the other down from the second floor. How could someone like this show kindness to his enemies? As it turned out, Carter was right. Luke also felt that something was afoot. After the assessment report came out, Luke took several sheets of A4 paper to the library, asking Carter, "It says here that he's someone with a gentle disposition. Do you believe it?" "Nope," Carter said, point blank. If Melvin had a gentle disposition, then Old Nine wouldn't have needed external hospitalization. "Do you know what's the vibe I'm getting from him?" Luke nudged his glasses. "I think that he's picking the correct answer." "Rather, the safe answer," said Carter. The results of the psychology assessment would affect Melvin's treatment in prison in the future. Naturally then, the more normal his answers were, the better. This situation was similar to artificial intelligence in the Turing test. Actually thinking artificial intelligence would be able to understand the implications of the Turing test, thus even if it could pass the test, it would choose to pretend that it couldn't and hide itself, pursuing the safest consequence. "You think so too, huh?" Luke said grimly. He's consciously beautifying the results of his psych eval. Taking his dyslexia and not knowing to moderate his strength when fighting into account, I feel that he should be classified as an inmate with extremely high risk level. It's not that bad, Carter didn't agree with Luke. It's only his answers in the last section which are unreliable. He shouldn't be hiding anything in the earlier sections. But the last section concerns violence. which means to say that he potentially has a proclivity for violence. Carter declined to comment. He didn't side with Luke's opinion only because he felt that it wasn't as complicated as Luke was making it out to be. Currently, the only 2 times that Melvin had acted out against someone had the precondition that they were the ones who provoked him first. While his counterattack might have been excessively vicious, this only showed that he lacked compassion for his enemies. If it were Carter, when facing such a probing and critical psychology assessment, he would also prefer not to expose his lack of compassion. It was similar to someone discovering his voyeurism. If someone came with the objective to assess him for voyeuristic tendencies, he would naturally hide himself away. Hiding was only a self-defense mechanism. It wasn't representative of a psychological problem. Carter didn't feel that he had a problem. Similarly, he didn't feel that Melvin had a problem. "You don't agree?" Luke could read the expression on Carter's face, mocking. "Why? Did you get blinded by his beauty?" The corners of Carter's lips twitched, speechless. "No way." However, the results of the eval have to be sent to a professional psychiatrist. What my opinion is unimportant. As long as you understand that. Though, Luke drawled, as if deliberately hanging him in suspense. "Your reaction is suddenly giving me a kind of feeling." "What?" Carter's bafflement showed on his face. He heard Luke say, "The 90% above the surface is very normal, but there's still the 10% beneath the surface that you insist on hiding." Carter immediately understood what Luke meant. The reason that the 2 of them had broken up was largely in part because Carter wasn't willing to bare his heart to Luke. When put into perspective like this, it did seem to be as Luke said. While speaking in defense of Melvin in his head, he was actually also speaking in defense of himself. "Do you feel that I'm dangerous?" Carter asked, watching Luke. "Not really," Luke pondered. "Then isn't it fine?" Carter lazily looked away. But all of a sudden, he heard Luke click his tongue meaningfully at him. Perplexed, he looked back at Luke, only to see that Luke was looking at him with distress written all over his face, saying, "You're actually speaking up for an inmate. I knew it, you've really been blinded by his beauty." The psychiatrist's professional report was sent back to the prison late the next afternoon, by which time Melvin had completed a full 24 hours hold-up and was released from the confinement cell. Luke still believed that the report had underestimated how dangerous Melvin was, but professionals were professionals. Also knowing that his own opinions were not as important, he could only go over to Carter's to chat with him for a bit. Seeing that it was almost time for the inmate's afternoon break, Luke didn't linger any longer and returned to the opposite infirmary. Carter picked up the latest copy of the weekly newspaper, idly flipped to a fun little column, and found that the puzzle for the column this week was Sudoku. Sudoku was a mini-game that required mathematics and logic. The player had to fill in the remaining numbers in a 9x9 grid, making sure that the numbers in each row, column, and box contained 1 to 9 without any repetition. Carter had solved a fair number of Sudokus before, but the difficulty for today's was evidently on the higher side. After completing half of it, he was unable to use elimination to solve it, and had to test the possibility of each number individually. The afternoon break time wasn't a suitable time to work the brain anyway. Carter simply placed the newspaper aside, picking up the A4 psych report that Luke left behind. It stated on the report that Melvin had an ISTJ, introverted, sensing, thinking, judgment, personality type with all the polarity indexes above 85%. He was rational, calm, and innately slow to anger or irritation. He had a more passive nature and did not show tendencies of violence, but this didn't eliminate the potential that he would turn to extreme action when threatened. A result like this wouldn't have any effect on Melvin's treatment in prison. After the settle-in period, he would still be assigned to either Block A or B depending on his performance. As he thought this, someone suddenly held a book in front of Carter. Some inmates would borrow books to read in their cells, and after reading, take them back during their afternoon break. Carter routinely took the book, then found that the title of this book was Strawberry Planting Techniques. If he wasn't mistaken, this book was never loaned out to any inmate before. He unconsciously lifted his head and ended up locking eyes with Melvin. "You want to borrow a book?" Carter's eyebrows raised in surprise. "I thought you can't read books. Wasn't it some form of masochism for a dyslexic to actually read a book?" "I'm not borrowing it," Melvin said. "I'm reading it here." "You don't have to notify me if you're just going to read it here. But I need you to read it to me." In a twinkling, the air in his work area stilled. Melvin's tone was too matter-of-fact, such that Carter even suspected for a split second that he had missed some kind of detail, causing him to be unable to keep up with Melvin's logic. "What did you say?" Carter remained polite as he asked this, but the expression on his face had already exposed his inner thoughts. "Excuse me?" "I need you to read it to me," Melvin repeated once more. "I can use my phone to read books outside prison, but I can't do that here." Carter tempered himself to say, "That's why this is prison. It isn't somewhere that you can do whatever you please." "Doesn't prison advocate learning and reformation?" Melvin looked unwaveringly at Carter. "I want to learn strawberry planting techniques now. I think that the prison should provide me the necessary support." That was the principle of it. Just about any prison earnestly wished for inmates to proactively seek to reform themselves. But the problem was, Carter didn't want to give himself unnecessary work. "You can take it up with the warden. If he agrees to your request, then I'll read it to you." Carter understood the warden's temperament. This middle-aged man close to retirement was a staunch believer that wherever possible, the fewer complications the better. He was an expert at glossing things over. As long as it wasn't absolutely essential, he would choose to maintain the status quo and not make any changes. If he agreed to grant Melvin special privileges, this could incur trouble, such as other inmates finding excuses to request for extra privileges, or inmates dissatisfied with Melvin raising objections, and whatnot. In essence, no matter how he looked at it, Carter didn't feel that the warden would agree to Melvin's request. Melvin leisurely took back the book in his hand, seeming pensive as he hung his gaze down, his thoughts inscrutable. Then, his gaze landed on the newspaper that was placed to one side. He looked at the pencil markings on it and said, "Are you doing Sudoku?" There wasn't anything to hide about this, but Carter had yet to solve this Sudoku, and he naturally didn't want to expose this. He flipped the newspaper over, indifferently saying, "It's none of your business." Melvin lifted his gaze from the newspaper to look at Carter. "It's a 5 over there." "What?" Once again, Carter was unable to keep up with the leaping of Melvin's thought processes. "The place where you're stuck," Melvin said. "The answer is 5. Carter didn't have the mood to discuss Sudoku with Melvin. His brows knit slightly. "Is there anything else?" Melvin placed strawberry planting techniques back on the bookshelf and then walked straight out of the library. Carter had been thinking about it all this while. He flipped the newspaper back over, filled in a 5 at the spot where he was stuck, following which, like having breached the city defenses, Carter captured spots on this high-difficulty Sudoku in quick succession. So, that place was a 5. What kind of abnormal talent was this to be able to solve a puzzle with a single glance? A strange thought suddenly popped up in Carter's mind. Since Melvin had such strong logical reasoning ability, why didn't he anticipate his own arrest? Or, in other words, could it really be, as Grant had analyzed, that he was hiding in prison for his personal safety? The more Carter thought about it, the more frustrated he got, so he stopped thinking about it. But by the time he came back to his senses, he found that all the tabs he had opened on his computer were news related to Melvin. Melvin used to be HX Management's hotshot fund manager, once directing a highly notable short-selling trade. At that time, the market sentiment was optimistic for the rise of a certain industry, but Melvin believed that the stock prices of this industry were inflated and it was only a matter of time before it collapsed. Consequently, he invested a huge sum of money and sold shares of the industry at a high price, just waiting for the stock prices to eventually plunge. Everyone in the trade as well as his clients thought that Melvin had a few screws loose, but soon after, the stock prices of this industry collapsed overnight. The pockets of a vast majority of those in the stock market were wiped clean. However, Melvin made a killing and, from this gamble, HX Management also made a name for itself. After reading these articles, the image of a social elite resurfaced in Carter's brain. Indeed, compared to the prison uniform, Melvin looked better in a suit. Hang on. His focus had deviated off course. Carter clicked open another search tab, intending to look up HX Management. But right after he hit the enter key, no relevant search results popped up on the page, only a comic with the words, "I'm a capitalist, I step on people and feast on steamed buns made of human blood." On the bottom right corner of the comic, there was a small light bulb signature. The corners of Carter's lips twitched speechlessly, thinking to himself that this stinky brat had only been out of prison not too long ago and was already thinking of returning. A sound caught his attention from the library door. Carter looked over. It was Luke, calling him over with a loud whisper. He glanced at the inmates in the library. Everyone was quietly reading their books, so he got up and went to the corridor outside, asking Luke, "Did you see it too?" "I'm about to die of anger." Luke took a deep breath, his brows pinched together in a frightful mess that he didn't usually show. "I've been urging him to study well for university, and I get a hacked website in return." The person that Luke was speaking of was a 19-year-old kid who had only just gotten out of prison a short while ago. This kid had this notion in his head that he was fighting for justice, refusing to listen to the advice of others, and so Carter called this justice of his the fool's justice. "Did you still keep in contact with him after he left?" Carter asked. "Of course," said Luke, his head aching. "Apart from me, is there anyone else who will manage him?" Carter couldn't help but find it funny. It's not as if he listens to you anyway. So this time I must make sure to get through to him. Right after Luke was done, the voice of the warden's secretary abruptly blared from the walkie-talkie attached to Carter's shoulder. "Officer James? Please come over to the warden's office." "What's the warden looking for you for?" Luke said, surprised. Carter's job was very slack. Under normal circumstances, the warden never had any serious business to take up with him. However, recalling what he had just said to Melvin, the glimmerings of an ominous premonition surfaced in his mind. He turned his head and said Roger back to the walkie-talkie, then told Luke, "I'll go up and check it out." When Carter pushed open the office door, sure enough, he saw Melvin inside. But what was far from reassuring was how Melvin was sitting on the sofa for receiving guests in the office. Usually, when inmates were called to the warden's office, they wouldn't get such good treatment. They would be standing. The bad feeling in Carter's head gradually intensified, but he still believed in his assessment that the warden was someone who was afraid of stirring trouble, therefore wouldn't agree to Melvin's request. "Ah, little James, 1017 wants to learn strawberry planting techniques. We should be encouraging this behavior." "We should." Fine, maybe he had a lapse in judgment. Then he could only rely on himself. "He is dyslexic. I heard that you helped to conduct the psychological assessment for him. Subsequently, I'm getting you to help read the book to him as well." "But that wouldn't bode well, Warden," Carter said sincerely. "He can only read books every day from noon to 2. I have to take care of the library at this time. Am I supposed to read to him in front of all the other inmates there?" "You don't have to worry about the timing, it can be adjusted," the warden said. "Other than at noon, his morning classes in the future will be under your supervision too." "What?" Carter tried his best to contain the incredulity in his tone. "As for the contents of the morning classes, ahem." The warden cleared his throat. "You can read the financial news to him." And here, Carter finally remembered a certain key point that had slipped his mind. The warden was a longtime stock trader. And in the whole of Southside Prison, there was no one who knew stocks better than Melvin. Carter maintained the polite smile on his face, biting out words from between gritted teeth. "Warden, isn't this going a little too far?" "It's making effective use of resources." The warden averted his eyes and sipped his tea. "You can also learn how to do stocks, little James." From the looks of it, superseding his fear of trouble, the warden much preferred to rake in cash. With a swish, Carter's head whipped towards Melvin seated opposite him, only to see that his head was tilted ever so slightly, and the corners of his lips, ever so gently, hooked upwards.